This program is brought to you by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.
This presentation is delivered by the Stanford Center for Professional Development.
It's an unusual format for us. Rather than having a single talking head out front, we have a panel of people who will appear sequentially, and then we'll have a chance to just basically talk. This particular the motivation for this particular gathering started with the disappearance of Jim Gray. I guess it's over a year ago now. 15 months. And, well, Jim was a friend of a large number of us, and we desperately miss him. His disappearance caused a large number of us to be involved in an effort to try to find him. And when that happened, I thought that it would be interesting to, when the dust somewhat settled, to talk about what it is that we go about to do when someone disappears at sea. There's a traditional mathematical essay. It's in James R. Newman's World of Mathematics. I remember reading it as a high school student, where the problem of finding a submarine led to a whole field of mathematics called operations research. Maybe that's a little bit like what we're looking at here, a whole new mechanism of using high-tech tools to solve rather old problems like finding a boat somewhere in the water. So the program today will start out with some short talks trying to set the stage for what happened. We have Captain David Swatland from the U.S. Coast Guard, who was involved with the Coast Guard side of the search and with everything else as well. He gives sort of an overview of what's going to happen. Jim's wife, Donna, is here, and she'll talk a little bit about what it looked like to be part of a family trying to both manage the independent private search, the media, because this was a media event, and of course working with the Coast Guard and others to help try to find out what happened. And then Mike Olson from, at that time, Oracle. Now he's become a self-employed retired person or something. Longtime friend, was involved with the high-tech side of things on a whole bunch of levels, and he's going to try to tell us a little bit about that. Once we've got the whole thing set out in broad brush, then we'll have an opportunity for questions and discussion about what might have been done differently, how we can leverage what we learned in the process, and so forth. And for those of you who don't know about this, on Saturday, this coming Saturday, there is a tribute to Jim being given at UC Berkeley, and I don't know about what the space availability situation is. When last I looked, they had none, or nearly none. So there is a website linked to our website, which, should you want to participate in that, you can find out whether that's even possible at this point. Donna may actually know, and you can mention that later. The official announcements for next week, probably ought to be done now before we get deeply involved. Our next week's speaker will be Charles Moore, and he's going to talk about the role of accelerated computing in a multi-core era. He's CTO at AMD. That's very different than this today's event. Captain, let me give you the floor, and I'll leave you to lead us on.
Can I stand?
You can stand or walk or
Okay.
pace, anything you want.
I'll try not to pace out of the... Oh, it follows me. I can go anywhere I want. This is great.
We had a speaker who insisted on walking on the banisters.
Okay, well, I'll try not...
He's from Berkeley.
My balance isn't that good, so I will refrain from that. Hi, everyone. As Dennis mentioned, I'm Captain Dave Swatland. I'm stationed at the Coast Guard sector in San Francisco on Yerba Buena Island, right there underneath all the bridge construction. And Sector San Francisco is responsible for all Coast Guard operations between the Oregon border and the San Luis Obispo Monterey County line south of here. And my boss was on vacation on the night of Sunday, January 28th, 2007, so I got the first phone call and ended up being the Search and Rescue, or SAR, mission coordinator for this case. And it was pretty all-consuming for a week and quite a bit of time after that. And I learned an awful lot, and I guess that's one of the reasons why I'm here, is to share some of that and also to let some of you know where and how the Coast Guard operates on a more routine basis. So I'll tell you a little bit about the Coast Guard, a little bit about that case, and then hopefully answer some questions. I say hopefully because both computers and electrical engineering were not my strong points in college, so I asked you to go easy on me a little bit. Coast Guard has its origins with a revenue cutter service established in 1790 by Alexander Hamilton to combat smuggling in the original colonies. When the life-saving service merged with the revenue cutter service in 1915, we became the U.S. Coast Guard, and also absorbed a number of other organizations like the Lighthouse Service and the Office of the Bureau of Marine Inspection and Navigation. Since that time we became the Coast Guard, we've accumulated a lot of other missions such as Homeland Security, icebreaking, aids to navigation, fisheries enforcement, counter-drug operations, alien migration, recreational boating safety, pollution response, and as I mentioned, the big one since 9/11, Homeland Security, or what we technically call Ports and Waterways Coastal Security. To do all these missions, the Coast Guard still has fewer people than the New York City Police Department. And even though we've gotten thousands of new people since 9/11, we're still just getting back to the staffing levels we had in 1992. If you compare the Coast Guard's fleet of ships and aircraft with the world's 50 largest seagoing services, in terms of age, we rank 49 out of 50. So we're not necessarily operating with the top-of-the-line equipment at all times, but we're trying. Since 2003, we've been part of the Department of Homeland Security, which in many ways has been a good thing because that's elevated us somewhat in the government's food chain. We used to be in the Department of Transportation fighting for funding with Amtrak and the FAA. So we have gotten quite a bit more funding in the last couple of years. And it's also put us in a much more visible position as far as the media and politics go. Our ongoing effort to recapitalize our aircraft and ships, the Deepwater project has gotten quite a bit of press lately because it didn't go as smoothly as we wanted it to. And it's had some contracting, political, and financial problems. But from where I sit at the kind of worker bee level in the Coast Guard, and this is meant with no offense to any of the other employees of Uncle Sam in the room, I think the American taxpayer gets a pretty good bang for their buck from the Coast Guard. Despite our increased emphasis on Homeland Security the last couple of years, the Coast Guard's primary mission remains search and rescue, and that's mostly what the public knows us for. Hurricane Katrina, where we rescued 10 years worth of people in the space of 2 weeks. The movie The Guardian with Kevin Costner and Ashton Kutcher, and For better or worse, David Hasselhoff and Baywatch on TV are the images that come to mind when people think of the Coast Guard. We're very good at the rescue part of rescuing. Even though we did away with our "you have to go out but you don't have to come back" motto a long time ago, and my wife appreciates that, our aircraft and boat crews perform daring and heroic rescues on a daily basis. If you average it out, we save 14 lives every day and assist almost 100 other folks. But honestly, the much more time-consuming, frustrating, and complicated part of search and rescue is the searching part. Search planning has come a long way in the last 30 years. We're now on our 4th generation of computerized search modeling. We have 2 different models, one for shorter-term inshore, close-to-shore cases, and one for longer-term offshore cases. And these models were developed by the Coast Guard Research and Development Center back in Connecticut in conjunction with search and rescue experts from all over the world. And that's the programs that are employed out throughout the Coast Guard in each and every sector command center and every district command center. We run the same computerized program and the folks are trained on the same stuff. Based on time, weather, search object, search asset, a search pattern is developed and passed to whatever units are out there actually looking. All of our ships, boats, and aircraft have computerized navigation equipment now, which basically you plug in the search pattern and it will actually fly or drive that search pattern for you while the people on the boat or the aircraft are either looking out the window or looking at the radar, depending on how good the visibility is. It sounds fairly simple, but it's really not when you think about it. The computerized modeling of Mother Nature has never been a very exact science. Human nature also impacts the modeling sometimes as well, since all the computer models are based on a drifting object, and if that object is actively affecting or impacting their speed or direction over the surface of the Earth, whether they're swimming, rowing, sailing, doing something like that, all that computer modeling goes right out the window. Coast Guard search planners do have access to satellite imagery, and we do use it at times. It's not much of the time due to the targets we're looking for. It's not always all that useful, and most of our imagery analysis are trained to be using that tool for security and law enforcement purposes anyway. You know, if you're looking for a person in the water, satellite imagery is not going to do you much good unless you take it to a resolution where it's going to take you hundreds of thousands of people to analyze it. And even then it would take you a little while. In reality, a vast majority of Coast Guard search and rescue cases don't involve computerized search planning, but analysis of radio or cell phone calls to try and figure out where someone is. And that person usually has no clue where they are, and that's the first problem. Just last night we got a call on the radio from a disabled vessel that said they were off of Monterey. And the thing was, our Coast Guard station in Monterey couldn't hear them, but the Coast Guard sector in Los Angeles could hear them off their Southern California high sites. So after a fair amount of trying to figure out where they were by the high site reception analysis and the circles of reception and where they might be, we figured out and eventually confirmed that they were actually off of Morro Bay, not Monterey, which is only 150 miles away from where they thought they were. But they at least had, were not sinking right away and could provide us some degree of communications, which not always happen. What makes this type of case so frustrating is that the Coast Guard has no direction finding capability in our radios right now. So if we get a call, we have to rely on that person to give us a position. We have no way to DF with an arrow on where that radio call is coming from. That technology is on its way. It's been on its way for years, and they keep telling us it's on its way. It was supposed to be here in the Bay Area in 2006, and now they're saying it's going to be sometime after 2010. That technology will certainly help us take a lot of the search out of search and rescue if we can finally get that. The technology we're currently running for communications is probably predates several of the people sitting in this audience. It's maintenance intensive, takes up an entire room, and is a hodgepodge of different systems that don't often work together very well. We do have the ability to record and analyze voice transmissions, but it's still running 90s technology and is not very reliable. At least most of the TV shows I watch, the folks analyzing voices on the TV shows have much better equipment than I do. Which used to be true, now it's not, but back in the 80s and 90s when we were chasing all the drug smugglers in the Caribbean, they all had much better technology than we did. One of the reasons this is very frustrating right here in San Francisco is because Sector San Francisco gets more uncorrelated maydays than the rest of the state of California combined. And an uncorrelated mayday is where you get a call for distress, but they don't give a location or any follow-up information. A lot of the times that might be somebody just using the wrong frequency or for a radio check. A lot of times it might be kids or people who want to see the helicopter fly by their backyard as they sit in a lawn chair. I can't tell you what drives people to do that, but we get more of those than the rest of the state combined. And it's pretty frustrating because without the ability to direction find to track those or anything like that, we can't tell where they are. And unless we can positively rule out that it's not a distress call, we have to go out and look. We also have the capability to record cell phone calls, but since most cell phone 911 calls come into 911 dispatch centers that are not run by the Coast Guard, we get all that information secondhand and rarely have the information to follow up with the caller. So most of those cases end up in us going out to look anyway because we have no way to rule out that it's not distress. A lot of 911 calls can be triangulated. We do have that capability to interact with the cell phone companies to do that, but when you're phoning in from offshore, especially in Northern California, a lot of time there's only one cell phone tower that's going to pick that call up, and you can't really triangulate off of one cell phone tower. It'd be a lot easier if people would buy their marine band radios and use the international hailing and distress frequencies like they're supposed to, but that involves money and everybody's got a cell phone, so it's a lot easier to use their cell phone until the batteries run out. And we know that never happens at the bad time. Historically, almost 20% of Sector San Francisco's 2,000 annual search and rescue cases are uncorrelated maydays. So if you do the math, that's a lot of time we spent chasing down stuff that we shouldn't have to chase down. We spend a lot of time doing that. The Coast Guard addendum to the National Search and Rescue Supplement lists the 3 phases of search and rescue as uncertainty, alert, and distress. I would add a fourth phase, and that's prevention. We're always focused on taking the search out of search and rescue, but if you take even the search part out and prevent people from getting into those situations in the first place, it would be a huge help. Usually it's not that complicated. Keeping your boat in good shape, keeping your boating skills up to date and proficient, having all the appropriate equipment for where you're going and what you're doing, and most importantly, maintaining your situational awareness will very often keep you out of trouble and keep us from having to come look for you. A lot of people say it's too much money. I was reading an article the other day. The latest technology in PLBs are personal locator beacons. You can buy one of them for about $170. And that will allow, whether you're on a boat or on land, if you go out and activate it, it will tell people where you are and they can come find you. Of course, the more cynical amongst the search and rescue community are worried that people are going to start using those as a crutch and they're going to go hiking without water or cold weather gear or go out in a boat without a life jacket, and as soon as they get in trouble they're going to go, somebody come rescue me. We certainly hope that's not the case and that people will be responsible and that we won't find people setting off their PLBs because they ran out of beer. That just, it's not going to help us do our job better. I only mention this for its prevention's place in the grand scheme of things. Given everything I know about the disappearance of Jim Gray, he seemed to be very well prepared, proficient, and had the right equipment and awareness to keep himself out of trouble the day he went sailing. So I don't mention that as anything towards Jim, just as a keep in mind in the big picture. 8:35 p.m. local time, Sunday evening, January 28th, the command center at Sector San Francisco was notified via phone call that a 40-foot sailing vessel with one person on board was overdue, returning back to its berth at Gashouse Cove Marina in San Francisco after a day trip to the Farallones. The owner-operator of the vessel, the sailing vessel Tenacious, Dr. Jim Gray from San Francisco, was an experienced sailor who had departed Gashouse Cove early that Sunday morning to sail out the Golden Gate approximately 25 miles offshore to the Farallon Islands to spread his mother's ashes. The reporting party, Dr. Gray's wife Donna, was in Wisconsin at the time, stated she had talked to her husband via cell phone approximately 10:30 that morning, at which time he was near the first buoy marking the entrance to San Francisco Bay entrance channel and would be back in port later that day. When Donna was unable to make contact with her husband later that evening, she called the Coast Guard. Upon notification, the Coast Guard the communications watchstander in the command center immediately tried to contact the vessel Tenacious on channel 16, which is the Marine Band hailing and distress frequency, and also to try his cell phone, because Donna had given us that number. We had negative results on each of those, both phone and radio. We then called the harbor master at Gashouse Cove Marina, who confirmed that the Tenacious was not in its slip, but that Dr. Gray's car was still there. We then recorded an urgent marine information broadcast, or UMIB, which is broadcast out over the channel 16 and basically alerts other boaters to the fact that we have an overdue and asks them to keep their eyes open and to call us if they see anything. We called the other marinas in the Bay Area to see if the Tenacious had pulled in somewhere else. A vast majority of Coast Guard overdue cases are resolved before we send people out, so we always do the call-arounds first to make sure that the boat hadn't pulled into a marina somewhere else, or that he wasn't hanging out with his buddy somewhere down the street. That didn't work either, so at 10:56 we launched the first Coast Guard asset. It was a 47-foot motor lifeboat from Station Golden Gate. Got underway from its pier at Fort Baker, right near the north end of the Golden Gate Bridge, and began searching. Crew of 4 was using their radar and their trained eyes on a track line search from the Golden Gate out to the Farallones and back, looking for Dr. Gray's bright red sailboat with the black mast and the Tenacious written on the side in white lettering. I would have a picture of it, but I left my little memory stick in the car, so I apologize. It was, especially for the Northern California coast in January, a very calm, windless night, and actually lucky for us, it would stay that way almost the entire week. Less than 20 minutes later, because of the size of the search area, if the boat had gone outside its track line back and forth to the Farallones, we diverted a Coast Guard C-130 fixed-wing aircraft that has a really good radar on it and about a 10-hour endurance, and they spent most of the night out there searching. By early Monday morning, we also had helicopters searching, both up and down the coast and out over the water, as well as an 87-foot patrol boat. The search for Tenacious and Dr. Gray ended up being one of the largest search efforts on the West Coast in recent memory, covering 132,000 square miles between the Mexico and Oregon borders between Sunday night and sunset Thursday, when the Coast Guard finally suspended its search. It's never an easy decision to suspend searching, but in this case, we had done everything we could with the resources we had. It was especially frustrating because we had absolutely nothing to show for it. But at that point, we had to stop. And to the best of my knowledge, no signs of the sailing vessel Tenacious or Dr. Gray have been found to date. The The Coast Guard addendum to the National Search and Rescue Supplement measures the success of a search effort in terms of probability of success. Probability of success is defined as the probability of containment, which is how likely it is that the object you're looking for is inside the search area you've designated, multiplied by the probability of detection, which is how likely you are to actually see the object you're looking for. The former is mainly a function of time and location, the latter mainly a function of weather, time of day, search asset, and search parameters. In planning the searches for the Tenacious and Dr. Gray, we initially focused on the area between the Golden Gate and the Farallon Islands using the standard drift tools, which actually wouldn't have taken the boat or a raft outside of an area between Point Reyes or Half Moon Bay. But as we saturated that area and came up with nothing, we had to expand our thinking and our searches. As the Coast Guard does with any extended overdue sailor case, we checked all the records for any cell phone, credit card usage, anything like that, and came back with nothing. It may sound like we watch too much TV by doing that, but these things actually do happen once in a while. Several years ago, the Coast Guard had a report of somebody falling over a cliff just north of Bodega Bay, and we used helicopters and boats and spent a day searching for him, only to find out that the gentleman was wanted on several arrest warrants, and the guy who had reported him off the cliff was his partner in crime. Through a coordinated effort with local authorities, the guy we spent the day looking for was located alive and well and living in Lake County several months later. We didn't think this was the case with Jim, especially after talking to Donna and his friends, but it was something we had to check out. After looking at all the options, we significantly enlarged the search area and spent the last couple days trying to take in all the possible scenarios we could think of. Basically covering all the areas that the Tenacious and Dr. Gray might have covered if they were actively motoring or sailing in some other direction except back home to their slip in Gassove Cove Marina. The motoring option probably wouldn't have gotten him very far unless he was carrying a lot of extra fuel, and that didn't appear to be likely. Nobody at the marina could remember him loading 55-gallon drums of fuel on his boat. And based on the prevailing winds and seas that week, he probably, he would not have outsailed our search areas. So I think we had a pretty good probability of containment. We might have missed him. I can't say for 100% sure that we saw him in those search areas, but towards the outskirts of the search area, yeah, there was probably a lower probability of detection, but as you got towards the center and you got those places where we went over and over again with helicopters and boats and C-130s, the probability of detection was pretty close to 100%. And in the area right off the San Francisco Bay and Golden Gate entrance, the probability of success was as high as I've ever seen it, mainly because of the number of assets we had out there for as long as we had them out there. In addition to doing that, we made a list of all the large merchant ships, tugs, and even a research vessel that went through the area that Sunday. And we made contact with all those vessels. In the case of the large merchant ships, we actually had people go out and look at those vessels to inspect them for any sign of a collision with a bright red fiberglass sailboat. We found no evidence of any collision with any of those vessels, even though it took us a couple weeks to track down all the ships and actually coordination with several foreign countries. We did find no sign that any of them had a collision with any type of boat that day. What made this search different for the Coast Guard and different for me especially was that even before we had suspended our search, Dr. Gray's friends and family had initiated a search effort that rivaled any civilian search this country's seen, pulling together an incredible array of smart, dedicated people and advanced technology. Air, land, and sea searches, satellite imagery analysis, computer modeling, sailing and salvage experts, and finally a months-long comprehensive underwater seafloor search were utilized in an attempt to find any sign of the vessel or the sailor, or even a clue as to what happened. From my terminally resource-limited perspective, it was a truly amazing effort. For a long time, the Coast Guard's motto has been do more with less, and it was pretty amazing to see what can be pulled together with a group of dedicated people and a little bit of extra funding. It was a truly amazing effort, and it opened up my eyes and a lot of my peers' eyes as to what could be accomplished with some advanced technology and the right people operating it. I certainly believe there's potential for some of these technologies to improve the Coast Guard search capabilities, and for the future use of public-private ventures to bolster the Coast Guard's expertise and analysis for search and rescue cases like this. There's a lot of great technology out there, certainly a lot of great technology that the Coast Guard does not have and probably will never get based on how we are funded. So we'll do the best we can when what we can get, and certainly any type of public-private venture with nonprofit organizations or anyone else who wants to step up and go, hey, we can help, we're certainly not going to turn down your assistance. Like I said, cases like this don't happen very often. Most of our cases are much more routine and don't happen offshore like that, but every once in a while there's a good one. I do want to remind everybody that this case and several other cases in recent history, notably the one for Steve Fawcett in Nevada, also reveal the limitations of technology. There's really still no replacement for the Mark I Mod 0 eyeball. Whether you're looking across the surface of the ocean or down a rocky tree-lined ravine, someone needs to look at that object in the water and decide whether it's a person or a boat or a raft or just another whitecap. And somebody needs to look down that ravine and determine whether that flash of light is a piece of an aircraft fuselage or just a puddle or a piece of ice. The technology is great, but it's just a tool for use by humans to go out and assist them in looking. And I say that not because if we took the search out of search and rescue, the Coast Guard would be out of business. I'd be happy to not have to go out and look for people. But it's hard to replace putting people out there, whether it's driving around in boats or walking around in the woods or the deserts or the mountains looking for whatever it is you're looking for. And there's also no replacement for creative thought and local knowledge and intuition in search and rescue. Whatever you want to call it, it allows searchers to account for the variables that mother and human nature add to any search effort. There will always be an element of right brain activity in search and rescue, and that's something we all need to keep in mind no matter how great the technology is. So I'd like to thank Dennis for the opportunity to speak, and I look forward to Mike and Donna and whatever questions everybody has. Thank you.
Thank you. Given the background here, Mike, maybe it's best for you to come up and take the next step where you talk about what didn't happen. You might pick up the microphone, yeah. Well, you better also get the portable.
Oh, there's nice work. While I'm doing that, let me actually power up here. Are there people who are attending virtually right now out in cyberspace?
Certainly are.
Okay, so for those of you in that category, I hope you can hear me. And I don't think you can see my slides, but you should have copies that were mailed around this morning. So I'm going to fire up PowerPoint here.
Once you're fired up there, you'll
All right, I'll be live.
you'll be live.
Now you guys know how many characters I have in my passport. All right. Good. let me go to slideshow mode. I'm going to speak only briefly. My goal is to surface the issues that I think may be interesting to discuss, but I don't want to dive into a lot of detail. I want you folks to ask questions that matter to you. And then secondarily, I'm giving a deeper technical talk on Saturday, and I wanted to save that talk for Saturday for the proper tribute event. So with that beginning, I would like to say that first and foremost, as one of the people involved in the amateur search, that when you go missing, what you really want is the pros looking for you. So David described the search missions and the search patterns that were sailed or flown by the Coast Guard. This is a map of the U.S. Coast Guard search sorties from the period of, I think, the 28th until the 11th. And you can see what he meant when he said, near the gate, between the Farallones and San Francisco, coverage was really complete. That area was saturated. It's a very large search box, and certainly something that we could not have done as individuals. In particular, flying open water search missions over deep blue water is difficult, requires special equipment and special training, and it's something that only search professionals know how to do. That said, we all woke up on the 29th of January and started to get email from one another with the news that Jim had gone missing. And it didn't take very long before a group of people, a number of them in this room, I think, started to think about ways in which they could help locate Jim. Bear in mind, most of us had no idea then what searching for a missing craft on the ocean meant. We had no idea what the problem is that we were biting off. And we really had no idea what the Coast Guard did in a case like this. We educated ourselves, and I think worked well together over the course of the next few weeks as we discovered that stuff. But a lot of what we walked into the search fairly naive. We quickly realized that we needed a more crisp mission statement than find Jim. We refined that over some time to use remote sensing data, tools, and volunteers to help direct the search for Tenacious. A few things. You guys know that Jim's colleagues, Jim's friends, spanned an enormous range of scientific disciplines. He had real scientists among his friends, not merely computer scientists. Physicists, chemists, oceanographers, astronomers, people who could, and in fact did, retarget satellites to image areas of interest to us. You know, it's a pretty remarkable asset to have if you're going to go missing at sea, is someone in NASA command who can move a satellite around to see if they can find you. Our goal quickly became to collect all the information we could to help direct the Coast Guard in searching likely areas. And later, we even flew search missions of our own with private craft to investigate possible sightings of the boat. But the goal of the technology was to figure out what the likeliest places were to place a Mark I Mod 0 eyeball. We use all kinds of high-tech techniques, and those of you who followed the stories in the popular press, who followed the blog and even participated, know most of this. We collected satellite and aircraft imagery of likely areas for the boat. We used a whole bunch of different techniques to analyze those images. We had multiple image specialist teams looking them over for and enhancing the images that we got to see if they could find the boat. We used the Amazon Mechanical Turk and thousands of untrained volunteers to look at individual tiles, one of them in the front row here, to look at individual tiles to see if they could find the boat. It's a longer discussion and maybe one that we can go into in the Q&A section, but actually I think it's an open question whether you're better off with thousands of untrained volunteers using the Mechanical Turk, or if you could get a team of, say, 100 real serious image processing experts to pick up work using a tool like that, to basically queue up work and review images. It's an open question which produces better results. We absolutely did get interesting targets from the Mechanical Turk search. We also needed to model the sea surface conditions and drift to plot trajectories of likely targets. You heard Captain Swatland talk a little bit about drift modeling that the Coast Guard does. Two problems to bear in mind here, right? First, you don't know where to look for the boat. Imagine where it may have stopped, and now let's use all the science we can to figure out where it would be now if it were there 4 days ago, so that we could image it, so that we could look for it in that place. We could put a satellite or an aircraft overhead. In addition, once you have those images, once you bring them home, you've got a pipeline of processing, recognition, image analysis, and then recognition of, yeah, we've got the tenacious here, or something that could be the tenacious, there's a target we need to go look at. That can take days, right? So if you have a picture of the boat on one of these images, you still need to figure out where it would have moved in that intervening time. Drift modeling was a very important part of the work that we did. We actually had 3 different teams running 3 independent models to predict the locations of objects that we thought were interesting. How consistent were the results? The answer is reasonably consistent, and in the cases where they were different, we looked in multiple places, right? Mother Nature is very hard to predict, right? Sea surface drift modeling is a black art, and the longer the time is that's elapsed that you're trying to model, the more uncertainty creeps into the model. So you know, the best thing... Say again? Did you combine the model? I can't speak to how the specialists combined the work that they did.
Mathematically to increase resolution.
Yeah, so could you increase resolution by doing that? My suspicion is these people, all of them close friends of Jim's and excellent scientists, use their best training and knowledge to get as much accuracy from their models as they possibly could. Right? But I don't know if that meant that they were borrowing work from one another. End of the day, we would wind up with some targets that we thought were interesting, and we would fly out and look at them. Right? You already heard from the Coast Guard, we found nothing. We found nothing above the water, we found nothing on the coast, we found nothing under the water. Right? Much longer discussion, what may have happened. I'll observe that the ocean is enormous, and you really can't understand how big it is until you start looking for something that's 40 feet long. Oh, and then by the way, this process gets repeated, right? If we spotted something we thought was interesting, perhaps we'll try to image it again. Just a few other observations on imaging. Satellites really aren't all that useful for sort of emergency use in SAR, and that the reason is, at least over the ocean, they're almost never looking down at open water, right? All of the interesting stuff to look at that the satellite imagery companies care about is on land, right? So in order to get imagery of open water, you often need to retarget a nearby satellite, and just that process takes days, right? You can't just fly one from wherever it is over to look at where you are. You've got to consider its current orbit and, you know, what its mission is and when that mission will be finished. It's a tribute to Jim that we managed within a day to get QuickBird imagery from Digital Globe and then Iconos imagery from the Canadian government as well. So we did manage to retarget satellites. NASA also put an airplane in the air searching part of the search box. And I think...
There's a few other things too about the nature of satellites flying over oceans too, which the U.S. Navy really does not want the general public to be aware of.
All right, so Eugene observes that in addition to goodwill, you need a security clearance to get access to these things. Oh, and by the way, the physics of the imaging device matters a great deal. Wind can reflect signals and obscure your visibility. So depending on the sensor on board the satellite, you may or may not get useful information. We also used a bunch of plain old shoe leather, low-tech techniques. One of the things that I was mostly involved in was keeping the story in front of the broadcast and print media. I was embarrassed how many of my friends and family actually watched Fox News and saw me on it with Greta Van Susteren.
It's embarrassing to find out your friends watch Fox News.
Yeah, yeah.
I had the same experience.
A number of volunteers, including graduate students, I think both here and also at Berkeley, hit the streets with posters, walked around the marinas, talked to harbor masters, put up posters, and we walked and flew along the coast looking for any evidence of the boat. So, you know, fairly simple, no computers involved stuff, and also not very successful. I want to highlight just a couple other recent searches, and then I'm going to talk sort of high level about search technology and whether there's a way in which we can sort of abstract some of what we learned and apply it to future searches. You all know the story of James Kim and family. James was a reporter for CNET. He and his family were on a road trip, went off-road in the northern wilderness, became trapped. Eventually, James's cell phone was spotted by a tower, and local ground search was able to sort of narrow down a search area, found his family. Tragically, he had tried to walk out. He didn't make it. He died. But that's a case where cell phone signals were sort of instrumental. Steve Fawcett, another widely known search.
Did you get any pings from Jim's cell phone?
No, not after the phone calls that he had made to his family. We did, almost a week into the search, try to loft a special detection device that would have been able to recognize his IMEI. A few problems with that. One is that the battery life on a cell phone, especially a smartphone, isn't that great, and it was wildly unlikely that he would have husbanded the battery and then turned it on at just the right moment when the airplane was flying over. Also, we didn't control that asset. It was owned by some SAR specialists in Colorado, and they were concerned about risk to life of their people flying out on a low probability mission. So we didn't manage to fly that mission. I'm skeptical it would have made a difference at that point. Steve Fawcett, lost in the Nevada wilderness in a small aircraft crash. Many volunteers participated there. Lots of amateur and professional aircraft flights looking for him. Once again, extensive visual search failed to find the craft. Those are the well-known ones, and those are the ones where collections of people got involved in order to aid SAR. Abstract from that, here's a question. How can technologists help the people who do this for a living? I think, one thing is we did use remote sensing tools in some interesting ways, not successful in the case of this search, but nevertheless interesting. And if we could find ways to systematize that and make those tools available to the pros, I think that might be interesting. I will say that cell phone signal detection seems to me to be a promising area to pursue, and more tools to do that sort of triangulation is a good thing. I mentioned the problem with satellite imagery, not having aircraft or satellites over the area you care about. That's a big issue. Timely imaging is critical. You've got to be able to get the images when they matter, and then, by the way, process them quickly to decide if there's anything to look for there, because situations can get bad very quickly. I'll also say that access to expertise is really crucial. These tools, without people to sort of interpret what the signals mean, are of worse than no use. They're a distraction. So if you want to deploy technology, you've got to deploy people alongside it who know how it works, right? And who are there to answer questions and make it go. This bullet, organization, struck me early in the search, right? In the first days, we became a group of maybe 40 people CCing each other on every single email message. And the search nearly fell over of its own inertia as a result. Somehow, by magic, we organized ourselves over the course of a weekend and specialized into teams. That organization at least made it possible for the Coast Guard to speak coherently to someone who could say what was going on, and for individual groups to concentrate on tasks that mattered. You have to be responsive in a search like this. Time really is of the essence. Bad things are happening out there in the wilderness or on the sea, and you need to move very, very quickly. Funding, administration, governance, all this stuff matters. That is to say, the volunteer organization that looked for Jim was a remarkable experience for me to participate in. It's probably not the right model if you want to systematize this. You really need someone who's going to hang around, wait for the phone to ring, and then deploy assets it controls to make a material difference in the search. This is a side comment, but one I got from a SAR professional that I've spoken to in the months after the search. In a lot of ways, the search for Jim, we were fortunate. We had only the Coast Guard to deal with. We could go to a single person who had jurisdiction over all of the ocean we cared about. Land-based searches are often more difficult because county lines matter. You often have to talk to the sheriff of each of the counties if you want access to tools and so forth. That's not to say that those law enforcement professionals shirk their duty or they're looking for glory or they fight with each other, but it's a bigger managerial problem. It's a larger audience of people to talk to, and complexity is absolutely a problem when you have to communicate in these things. I want to close with a question to those of you who were Jim's colleagues. Jim was a practical scientist. He was interested in applied research. How could I take computer technology and apply it in a real practical way to a problem that's going to make a difference? So here's a challenge to the computer scientists at Stanford. How can we apply people and technology to make a positive difference in search and rescue efforts, right? It's not merely computers and gee whiz imaging devices, right? But how can we roll those out in a systematized way with the intelligence attached to them to help on demand in a search? Those of you looking for interesting research problems, this is, I think, not merely a technical problem, but also social, governmental, organizational. I think this would be a very interesting problem to work on, and I encourage you to do it. I'm going to stop there, hand over to Donna, and then we can take questions. All right, thanks.
I'm just going to talk shortly about what this experience was like from a family perspective. And in fact, I have Jim's sister, Gail Gordon, sitting right here in the audience. I think everything about this started small and got very large, much larger than we had ever dreamed of. You know, I was in northern Wisconsin skiing with my childhood girlfriends, which I've been doing for decades, and you know, Jim's supposed to call and he doesn't, and so you worry in your head, and then you worry with your girlfriends, and then you worry with the Coast Guard. And then there's a press conference, because that's what the Coast Guard does. No one really knows who Jim is. And then it just became larger than life in wonderful ways, and also in ways that the family, I think, we just weren't expecting or used to. You know, so the loss was profound, and we had a lot of hope, and it seems like a very long time ago sometimes, and it seems like yesterday, but you know, the above water search was one of the most compelling experiences of my life, and if Jim had been there and a part of it, he would have just been amazed at it. When we didn't find anything above water in almost, I think, 3 weeks of searching, we then searched underwater. I hired a company that was already surveying the coast of California, Fugros. And in fact, the article about the underwater search is in the Tribute Proceedings, which is a book that will be distributed at the Tribute in Berkeley. And there's room for more people if you care to come. The underwater search was painful. The Coast Guard actually called, and I talked to you regularly, and I remember apologizing to David for asking some question, and I remember you saying, "Don't ever apologize for this. We are used to looking for needles in haystacks." And a lot of people were not used to that and were not comfortable with, you know, should we be searching underwater? This is a waste of your time. We had talked about it in the family, and we very much wanted to find out what had happened. And so we first had this high hope that we would find Jim above water. We then had this large hope that we didn't even really want to have, but that we would find Tenacious underwater and find out what had happened to her. So we searched over 3.5 months, 300 square nautical miles of the seafloor around the Farallones on the paths that Jim was most likely to come home on with a professional group of people. And that search ended May 31st of last year. And that database is being donated to the Monterey Bay Research Group, which I think might be of some use to them in some of their work. At that point, it's the end of the underwater search. We don't have one trace, nothing. And I think the family just was very exhausted, and we were adrift. By that time, we were learning to understand terms like ambiguous loss, and I had met Pauline Voss, who's actually a psychologist who specializes in this and who is speaking at the Tribute, and worked with various groups this year when tributes were given in Jim's honor or in the past months. I think the family recouped that summer. I went down to Monterey in September with Paula Hawthorne, and on the trip back, after we'd met with James Billingham and looked at, you know, what Jim had been doing, what work he'd been doing there, and I just said, you know, I think that we really do need to plan a tribute. And I had been approached about funerals and such, and I think we were very uncomfortable with that simply because of the ambiguity. And so instead of focusing on Jim's status, whatever that was, we decided to focus on what we knew about Jim and his work and who he was as a person. And we started planning this tribute in late September. And it was just like the search. It started really small, got really large, and that's because so many people cared about Jim, and because Jim had worked with so many different people. So between the autumn and now, we work to bring about this tribute at Berkeley, which is an all-day event, and we're going to be having a general session from 9 to 10:30 with speakers talking on various aspects of Jim, as well as Mike talking about the above water search. And then the rest of the day there'll be some small technical talks that go on till about 5, and we're recording all of it. So from the perspective of the family, I think it's been an excruciatingly painful time. Things like this can tear people apart. I think in the end we came together. And I think that you take this experience and you try to do positive things with it. For example, working with the Coast Guard to see, there's all this technology around. Is there anything we can do, anything we can donate that would help? For the San Francisco sector in particular, I tend to like to do things very, very locally to try and make a difference. So that's really all I have to say from the family perspective, except that I just continually, despite our tragedy, think how incredibly fortunate we were to have such a group of people coming together to look for Jim, and how they came together. Mike talks about organization, how you needed it, but you did it. And I watched the Coast Guard come together with the Microsoft guys and all these technical people who are usually competing with each other, and it was really, really profoundly wonderful to see that. It just shows people can come together even if you think they can't. And that's really it. That's all I have to say.
So I guess what I'd like to do is ask for questions, if there are questions. I'm sure there are things that we all would like to know.
You mentioned one of the search techniques was to ask harbor masters, and the other was to ask other boats that were possibly in the general vicinity if they'd seen the boats you're interested in. How often do other boats actually provide useful information? I'm sure it's some fraction of the time, but is it a lot?
Not a lot, no. Most of the time we're looking for an overdue. When we find them, they're not really overdue. They're tied up somewhere else. They've decided to anchor out. They've stayed fishing longer than they plan to. But every once in a while, especially with the commercial fishing community, if we have fishing boats that are missing, those folks are very good about looking out for each other, and we'll say if they've seen somebody else around, or if they saw him yesterday fishing, or if he was en route to someplace he doesn't normally go. But it's a fairly small fraction, but it's something we do, and every once in a while we get some bit of information that helps.
Captain, a couple of months ago, there was a boat off the coast that was part of a race, but it, unlike Jim's boat, had a two-man crew with one survivor.
No, there was, yeah, I can fill you in.
And then the hull of the boat was later found below the side scan sonar. Is that correct? Can you say a few words about that?
Correct. It had two people on it. They were part of a regatta. They were the last boat in the regatta, and when they didn't show up back at the yacht club at 9 o'clock at night, they were reported missing. It was the sailing vessel Daisy. There were two people on board. We did end up finding the hull, but only because it sank in relatively shallow water, and it still had a horseshoe life ring tied off to it, which was floating right outside the San Francisco ship channel. So we did find the life ring, and when we noticed it wasn't moving and it still appeared to be tied off to something, Coast Guard doesn't have divers, but we managed to talk the San Mateo County Sheriff's divers into going out there and taking a look, and they actually dove down and found the deck, the cabin, and the mast, and the sails of the ship, but not the hull. Somehow the hull had separated from the deck. There was no obvious signs of collision with something large that would have caused that separation. So we're still at a mystery. Even though we found more parts of it, we're still at just as much a mystery as to why it happened. One of the bodies did wash up down towards Half Moon Bay. The other body has not been located.
Why doesn't the Coast Guard have divers?
That's a good question. I don't know. We don't. There are divers on the icebreakers, but that's about it. We don't have search and rescue divers. Whenever we have to dive, like up in the Delta, there's a fair amount of search and rescue diving, but it's all the county sheriff's folks. Yes, sir.
There was an earlier question about the cell phone. Do we have the ability to, I assume that the cell phones are regularly keeping in contact with a tower someplace. Is that correct?
Yes.
And do we have, are those records available from, I mean, the phone companies have them, but do they record them? Do they make them available? Is that a useful technique? And then apply that question to the Jim Gray situation.
So the question for those who are in the audience can hear is, does the technology of cell phones keep in touch with towers periodically, and can those records provide any kind of forensic information about the path of the phone? And the short answer is yeah, absolutely. The phone company isn't permitted to release those records to any but a law enforcement organization. Turns out Coast Guard is one, right? So modulo sort of political wrangling with the cell phone provider that Jim had, I think that data was made available and was examined and basically wasn't useful. It documented that he sailed in exactly the direction he said he was going to sail in the morning and did not come back. Right. So when he got far enough offshore that he lost contact with the nearest cell tower, he never came back in range. And
His phone left the radius. So.
Yeah, that's right. His phone behaved consistently with everything else we already thought.
Right.
Yeah.
In Kim's case, some technician made down to even lower level information that usually they don't even record, but they happen to have on the hard drive there. Did you guys do that too?
I don't know what information was available in the Kim case
Anyway,
that would have been useful.
They got some more than normally the phone companies do, but some technician went all the way down, got a little more out of it. They got a few more pings out of it.
Unless you know more about what we did with
I
it.
don't
Yeah.
know anything more than that.
Anyway, that's an opportunity.
Yeah. I want to be very careful. I don't want to cast aspersions. I will say that large organizations are difficult to work with in emergency situations.
That was clear in Kim's case. That
Yeah. Yeah.
They had to talk to the technician and was blah, blah, blah.
Yeah. You've had your hand up for some.
And I have two questions. One for you. In the search, were you also looking for objects that the tenacious might have hit? You know, like a floating container or a big log or something. I once was the subject of a Coast Guard emergency call. I never had to be searched. But that seems to be the scary thing.
We did, while we were out there looking for whatever might have been out there in terms of the tenacious or a raft or Jim himself, we obviously were looking for whatever else was out there, and we were able to find a fair amount of stuff, whether it was a floating log or a Clorox bottle or something like that. The weather conditions were so good that entire week that we saw all kinds of things out there. Nothing that jumped out at us as if something that could have made a 40-foot sailboat just disappear. Obviously, that stuff could be out there. There are containers that fall off ships that float, this far below the surface, that far below the surface. There are logs out there that do the same thing. There are whales out there. There's a lot of things that could have happened that we really have no way of confirming or denying. But everything that we saw out there was investigated and was ruled out pretty much as a cause of the disappearance.
I'll make 2 points. So, one is that, as I said, the ocean's an enormous place, and it's entirely possible that a submerged container or something else was there, became worse than neutrally buoyant and went away, or it was just missed because, things drift. I'll also say we really don't know what happened to Jim. We do know that there is a scenario in which the tenacious hull could have been holed in a way that would cause it to sink very, very quickly and bow up so that everything that was basically, you know, free floating inside the boat would be trapped and carried to the bottom with it. What is unusual, I think, in this case is not only did we not find the boat, we found no wreckage. We found no oil slick. We found just nothing.
To carry on that thought, sailboats, sailors are usually very conscientious about making sure everything is tied down properly, which is great for making your boat seaworthy, but when it sinks, it doesn't make for a whole lot of stuff that floats up to the surface. Or when a fishing boat sinks, there's almost always this huge debris field of beer cans and coolers and fishing boats, all kinds of stuff.
So you sailors, please leave a lot of empty beer cans.
Yeah. So it's that scenario of being holed and sinking quickly and not leaving any debris is certainly more of a possibility with that type of sailboat and that type of sailor than it is with a lot of other boats.
I sailed a long time ago, and it was a wooden Tahiti ketch, so you figure some wood would.
Yeah, and the fiberglass boat can be holed, but not let go of any pieces, where like a wood boat would start to disintegrate and
break up.
Yeah, break up.
I had a question about the direction finder. I don't understand. I remember Arrow Anson in 1960 had direction finding equipment, you know, in Western Germany to check what the Russians were doing. You know, I was working for NATO then.
That is true, and it's still true that the Navy and the Air Force and the Army have much better equipment than the Coast Guard does. I will not disparage my government's politics on how they fund and what their priorities are, but suffice to say that the DoD has a much bigger budget than the Coast Guard does.
This was British, but still very old crappy aircraft, but it didn't do that.
Our aircraft have direction finding equipment, but they're not in the air all the time. What we need is direction finding equipment on our high sites like Mount Diablo, Mount Tam, Mount Hubbanum, where we're picking up all these radio signals.
Thank you.
Any questions?
Was Tenacious equipped with a personal locator beacon or other radio beacon that would automatically activate?
Yes. To the best of our knowledge, it was equipped with that device. Those devices are designed to go off one of three different ways, either manually or hydrostatically if it gets to a certain depth, or if it's turned upside down. We received no signal from Tenacious's emergency locator beacon.
Did you have a radar reflector too?
Yes. However, our radar coverage outside of the Golden Gate, we don't maintain radar out there to track small ships. We maintain radar out there to track large merchant vessels as part of the vessel traffic service. And we have no radar recording device, or we didn't at the time, which even if we did have radar contact with the Tenacious, we wouldn't have been able to go back and look at the tapes. We do have AIS track, the automatic identification system, which a lot of the large merchant vessels and now the fishing vessels have, which is a pretty good tool. That's how we were able to, one of the ways we were able to recreate the track of the Costco Busan when it hit the bridge. But that's not a piece of equipment that many recreational sailors are going to have at this point.
So no GPS beacon.
Personal locator devices. They're basically a GPS unit and a broadcast to the location.
Correct.
Yeah. So an ID and a squawk and a GPS.
And it does that once every 10 minutes or something like that to minimize.
Only when it gets in trouble, right? If it falls in the water, it begins transmitting.
Yeah. But if it gets trapped in the hull, it sinks.
Correct.
It traps the
and the last land-based ones, like the one the hikers carry around, you have to automatically turn that one on. I think there are some specially designed ones for skiers that will go on if you get buried in an avalanche. I'm not quite sure.
They run in transmit mode.
Okay. So they're on all the time?
Yeah, and then you turn yours to receive mode when you want to go look for somebody.
Seawater is relatively impervious to radio, so.
Extremely. It's a conductor.
Yeah. Your SAR, did that spacing information? Polarization information? SAR. The SAR satellite images. Do they have phase information? What's the resolution? You can get about the North resolution.
So first, we didn't use any special purpose search and rescue satellites. We used commercial and governmental research satellites that were retargeted to go look. Resolution, sort of 1-2 meter range, was available in a number of different spectral frequencies, often sort of not adjacent frequencies, but two different ones. Actually, Eugene may be able to say more. The QuickBird satellite is designed to collect visual images, and the rest were other than visual spectral ranges. And a big part of the work of the image processing team was collecting that data and trying to tease out what might be solid shapes on seawater.
Typically a meter resolution you're talking, or sub-meter.
I can speak a little bit to that. The resolution of something the size of the Tenacious in pictures that I saw would have been a small number of pixels.
Yeah.
And the images were fairly noisy. So
that's why I'm asking.
It was basically an operation where the stuff I did was basically triage. Went through a large number of things and decided that these were not candidates for further.
Yeah.
It's basically phase information you had a chance to see. Getting a few more pixels to actually recognize it, but without it.
Yeah, that's right. But Dennis makes a good point. Simply weeding out all of the images that weren't interesting and leaving behind a much smaller population that may be interesting was a huge help, because then the specialists could go in and look at those very closely and concentrate on them.
Funny that the phase information actually can do some automatic processing and distinguish waves from non-waves, or biology from non-biology.
I am not enough of a scientist on that sort of remote sensing technology.
I'm just curious if you said something.
Yeah, I don't know. You had your hand up?
I'd imagine that the San Francisco area is fairly busy. What is the density of traffic in this area, say, compared to other? One ship every 5 square miles, 10 square miles most of the time?
It depends on what size ship you're talking about. For large merchant ships, we probably get anywhere between 15 and 20 arrivals or departures every day. Inside the bay, there's 70,000 ferry transits every year, not to mention all the recreational vessels, the sailing vessels. We issue 1,300 marine event permits, and that one regatta requires a permit. One regatta might have 50 boats in it. Inside the bay, the traffic is just tremendous, especially in the summertime. Outside the bay, it drops off significantly, especially once you get outside the little circle that goes up as far as Bodega Bay and down as far as Monterey. Outside of that circle, it slims out almost to nothing, except for people transiting back and forth and fishermen. But you know, there are some recreational folks and some fishermen who venture outside the bay.
But within that, I'd imagine that within that semicircle you described is 95% of your rescues or more.
Yes.
Because where the people are is where the people can get lost.
Correct. And not actually, probably 90% of our stuff occurs from the Golden Gate eastward. And of that other 5%, 95% of that occurs in that little semicircle around Monterey and Bodega Bay. Yes, sir.
For those of us who know sailboats, could you say a little more about what that place in the sailboat is where it could have sunk like a...
I'm repeating information that I got from an expert in the sailboat, but the answer is that where the prop shaft enters the hull, on this particular make of sailboat, if something struck the prop shaft or the prop just right, it could hold the hull pretty badly and take on a significant amount of water very quickly. Right. So again, I was never on Tenacious, and I'm not a sailor, but that is the information that I have from the guy who looked at the boat and knew the boat.
Which is not where you would damage your boat if you ran into something, unless we were going backwards.
That's the peculiar thing.
Yeah, but it is right. If you pick the place to hull your boat or to breach the hull, that would be the worst place. Is either the rudder post or the prop shaft.
The hole in the bow would not sink the ship like that.
Unless it was a really big hole, probably not.
Yeah.
No, I think it would sink, but it wouldn't. Your point is that it would sink with a companionway up, and you'd get
you might see some debris.
flotsam.
Yeah, you might see some debris.
So what do you think what has happened most likely? I mean, in the end, you should tell
That's
us.
the $64,000 question. I can't answer that. Once I get out of the realm of what we accounted for in our searches, it just becomes too much to think about. So I can't. It could have been any one of a number of things.
I will say this, and I said it in the tribute proceedings that I wrote up, and to Gail and to Donna, this is, I know, a very difficult and sensitive subject for you. I knew Jim pretty well. I know a lot of his friends who knew him very well. I know his family. I don't believe he ran away. I know that there's a lot of speculation early in the search. Oh, the guy did a rabbit. He's down in Mexico drinking pina coladas, having a wonderful time.
Yeah.
Pardon my French, that's horseshit. It's not the kind of guy he was. And by the way, if he wasn't having a good time in his life, he didn't need to go hide, man. He was well-to-do. He could absolutely blow the bolts and live on, right? He didn't need to do that. I think that the ocean is very large, and so when something gets lost, you have to expect you might not be able to find it. And it's also very unforgiving. If he had a bad 3 minutes out there, that's all it would take. I don't know what happened to the boat. I believe that Jim was lost at sea. I think that that's what happened.
No condition before he sails on.
He's a responsible sailor. Yeah.
So it seems that we're begging a question of the captain, which is, you have the attention of some very smart people who know a hell of a lot about technology. Imagine you had no money problems and no political problems. Do you know what you would want?
Well, we've already been talking to some people. One of the things we could use is certainly the cell phone direction finding equipment. That would certainly be a large help. And we've actually been working, as a matter of fact, I got some communication today from one of the folks that works for me. He's been working directly with a company that they've gotten the aviators involved, because that's who would actually carry this equipment to make it the most effective. And at first there was some concern about carrying new technology into Coast Guard aircraft because of the hoops you have to go through to make it work. But we seem to be able to fast track that, and we might be able to get that out in the field a lot quicker than we originally thought. The ability to direction find on radio calls is absolutely priceless. And when that technology gets here, it will make our jobs easier in many ways. It'll make it busier in some ways, because we'll have more information about these calls, and we'll probably spend more time searching, or at least dispatching resources. Hopefully it will result in less searching.
But you might be able to reject many calls too.
Yes, but we will be able to reject the calls that we end up, the calls that the little kid makes from his mom and dad's boat parked in the trailer in Livermore. We have no way of telling that radio call came from Livermore. For all we know, it came from the Farallon, so we have to go out and look. But ideally, what I would really like is more boats and more eyeballs as well, because as I said, there's really no substitute for sending people out there.
I want to make one obvious point, and so forgive me, but in addition to being a waste of resources to send professionals out to search, this is also dangerous work, right? And so if you can keep people at home on false alarms, you're much better off. It's no longer true that you have to go out and you don't have to come back, but it's still dangerous work, and these are people who are putting their lives on the line. When we were working on the search, there was about a week when we wanted to put aircraft in the air, and it simply wasn't safe to do so. And it broke my heart not to be able to get up and go look every single day, but it wouldn't have been fair, it wouldn't have been right to the people that fly those missions to put them in that much danger.
The UAVs, these days, you didn't have any access? The military certainly has it.
To my knowledge, no one in the group explored the possibility of using unmanned.
That's a big developing thing we could talk about over dinner.
And And that is,
I mean, it's a $60
I wrote
billion.
the paper on the subject, so I'm not.
Yeah, it's a $60 billion project for the state of California.
I understand, you still
part of
call somebody a Lockheed, whatever the.
part of the Coast Guard's Deepwater project to recapitalize our ships and our aircraft includes, or at one time did include UAVs. I'm not sure whether they're still in the project because of the budget problems we had, but obviously that is a way to get some type of sensor capability out there while lowering the risk to people. And since UAVs are cheaper to fly than manned aircraft, we could get more of them out there looking.
What would be your priority, since we talked about having Christmas? So if you had the choice, what mix would you do?
UAVs are a great tool. They're a little more problematic in a place like the Bay Area because there's a lot of other commercial air traffic, and civilian pilots and commercial jet pilots and air traffic controllers don't really like to have UAVs flying through their airspace for obvious reasons.
Well, they're supposed to be able to listen and avoid. But
yes, I know. But obviously for search and rescue offshore, they're a great platform. And if we could get some that way.
Is it best to, if I'm on a boat, best for me to call a phone?
For information on other online Stanford seminars and courses, please visit study.stanford.edu.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.